You can't control genetic information, and you can't always control organisms. And you don't want them to go to Jurassic Park and do damage or eat people, etc. I think eat people is pretty likely. Um, if humans are in a gigantic bottle and there's stochastic interactions happening, right? And a subset of those molecules or people in that bottle that you could randomly bump into could help you get to the next step. By default, the more people you interact with, the more likely you are to find that person or to get into that to interact with that person. So this is like more of the importance of the network. I think it's important humans go to space. Let's say we are the only sentient life in the universe. Like, it seems valuable to move that out beyond just a single planet. Like, better to have more than one backup, basically. Anytime you have a self-sustaining colony, you're going to need biology, because biology is good at keeping biology alive. Most folks have focused on Mars. I'm not like tied specifically to Mars. I think each planet presents its own problems, as does like intergenerational ships that don't involve you terraforming a specific planet. We can be very suspicious of new technologies, but very often we're enthusiastic adopters of tools. That's what brought us to where we are today. Like, we are prolific tool users, and the question of like, are my glasses a implant or a prosthetic? We will continue to adopt and use those things.
Hey everyone, that's Renegade Science Podcast and your host, Marie-Émile. My guest today is Natalie Ma, an entrepreneur and synthetic biologist building companies from novel tech to good at the bedside and beyond. Currently, she works as a head of business development and customer discovery at Deep Origin, a company that helps scientists solve disease, develop drugs, and extend health span by building tools that simplify R&D, simulate biology, and untangle the complexity of life. Natalie is also interested in so many things: biotech for space travel, terraforming, gene editing, physics, and even mushrooms. But enough of an intro, let's jump straight into the talk. One more thing, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Let's go. Hello, Natalie.
Hello. How's it going, Maria?
Oh, going very well. How about you?
It's going pretty well. It's definitely a little chilly here, but not quite winter yet. It's just always a little bit foggy in San Francisco Bay Area. So,
but it's a good reason to wear a Deep Origin.
Yeah, the Deep Origin jacket, exactly. So yeah, and thanks again for having me on the show. Really excited to chat about some of the fun things I have done in life and career, and hopefully it's useful to somebody.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So let's start the light on these amazing things. Let's start with your story. So how did you become a scientist?
That is an excellent question. Some of it was that it was always sort of in some ways expected. So both of my parents are fairly educated. My dad's a PhD in math. I did not want a PhD in math after sitting and doing homework with my dad in math. And, in order to solve some moderately complicated calculus, you need to know a lot of theory all of a sudden. So I had sort of always expected I would go to graduate school because of that. So I went into undergrad sort of thinking about how to do research. I had actually started in environmental science because I had gone on this sort of program through the American Legion, which is like a veterans program here in the US. They had done a scholarship for environmental science. I am not a veteran. My parents are not veterans, but I happened to have won like one of the awards, and they took us on like sort of a forestry and environmental science workshop in the Tahoe area when I was a kid. And I was like, this is really valuable. California is, prone to very specific ecosystem changes. And so I went to undergrad for environmental science at a time when I would sort of argue that environmental science was very anti-science. So like I went to UCLA, the program was very scientific, but there was a huge number of people within the program that I remember arguing that science could not help us in any way, right? It's like science is the root of many of these evils and problems, and like technology basically can't be used to solve these problems. I remember having these discussions with folks who were like, let's return to like a subsistence agriculture society and live in in peace with nature. And I'm like, you realize that the caloric output of like that society is so low, are you going to pick the part of the population that starves? Like, right? It's like, there's some very serious ethical questions there. So I remember being like, again, I love the curricula. I think UCLA's curricula was excellent, but I do remember being very frustrated with the philosophy in like the early 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s in environmental science. And I was like, well, I'm going to go engineer. I want to solve problems, not just characterize them and talk about, can we do things better in a philosophical sense? And so I'd heard a podcast from Radiolab actually about work that was being done in genome engineering and like sort of creating engineered organisms. I think they interviewed George Church, of course. And I was like, that is what I want to do. I do synthetic biology because I want to engineer organisms to help solve environmental problems. I went to graduate school for that. So sort of what one would typically call a harder science if we want to rank the sciences, which I would not recommend doing. But Yale was fantastic. I worked near Fair and Isaacs. And then I worked specifically on what we call the Jurassic Park problem. So if you engineer organisms and put them in open environments, they're going to pass DNA around. People worry about GMOs for a variety of reasons, particularly in the EU. But I think one of the reasons that we do worry is that you can't control genetic information, and you can't always control organisms. Controlling organisms turns out to be, I think, a little easier on the microbial side than controlling the genetic information. But like, how do you put these things in open environments and have them work as expected remains a big question. And you don't want them to go Jurassic Park and do damage or eat people, etc. Eat people is pretty likely. So we had created sort of essentially genetic firewalls, right? Can you isolate an organism genetically from the rest of its environment by changing the genetic code it reads in, sort of like changing the operating system of the organism? And then can you see if that actually changes the ability for it to like release genes into the environment or pick up new genes and do something? And so we could see that was the PhD work. It was pretty exciting. We demonstrated that you could actually create sort of barriers between these engineered organisms and natural organisms. And that's sort of the point where I remember talking to my PI about, okay, we've done all this work in the lab. Should we do like a field experiment, right? Because that's like the natural next step when you're an environmental scientist is like field work. And my PI, and I'm pretty sure DARPA, the Department of Defense agency, who funded our work, were like, hell no, we are not putting this out. And I was like, oh, well, okay, when do you think, we'll be ready to do that? And they were like, maybe 30 years. And I was like, okay, this is like a different expectation that I had about making an impact in grad school. But I guess sort of that was in short sort of what drove me to become a scientist. And then, I don't want to say drove me out of science because I still do like a modicum of science. I'm gonna like, if this is a faux pas, but like there's a microscope right there.
Yeah, I saw that you
my
bought a microscope for birthday.
Yeah, I can dive into a little bit of why that is later. But yeah, so I still do science, but I sort of moved over to like the startup side in part because out of that whole experience where it's like, okay, the timeline to impact is actually going to be really long here. I'm going to be done with my career by the time we're like seeing the impact in reality or in like the working world. I talked with a mentor, Drew Endy, who cornered me during a mushroom foray at a Gordon conference. And he was like, what are you doing with your life, young graduate student? In a good way. And I was like, I'm frustrated about this. And he's like, you should really go into startup industry, in particular startups, if you want to make an impact. And so that was sort of how I started this journey into the startup world.
I wonder, so you are coming from academia where like your expectations about making impact are not aligned with reality, which is very slow. Is it different in the startup world and how these two worlds coexist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So like, I think the academic world operates differently, and I'll sort of separate this into two parts. One of them is like the level of funding, which I think drives a lot of this, and then I think the sort of the expectations and the timelines. And some of this will be critical of both systems, right? So like on the funding side, in industry, even in startups, there's just more money available, right? Because there's an expectation that profit will be made back. So like, this is something that's always important for people to keep in mind. If you raise capital, diluted capital from venture capital or other shareholders, you now, it's a thing to celebrate, but you now have a responsibility to those shareholders to return that money back at least a few X multiple. And ideally they're looking for a 10X multiple on that exit, right? So you're getting more money because there's an expectation of somebody that they're going to make more money off that. And that's, you give up equity in exchange for that. In academia, that expectation doesn't exist and the money is less, right? Because there is no guarantee that the discovery you make is going to make more money. And I know that there is like a huge push for like basic science, doing basic science without an end point. And there are really good examples of that. But I would say that in general, like probably a minor gripe on the academy, people can send me to hate mail. Like I do feel like there is there's been a divergence of like, here are real world problems and like, here is what the academy wants to solve or like what academia wants to solve. But that's not for every faculty member. Like in probably every institution, you can point to faculty members who firmly understand these are key problems in the world that are critical for human health, environmental health, like any of these applications. But there are definitely also situations in which faculty get quite good at writing grants, and then you solve problems that I would argue are not real problems. And for all the graduate students listening, like if you're curious or wondering, ask your faculty member where they got their information from, not in like a malicious way, but like or an accusatory way, but like, hey, like this problem that we're highlighting, like who has identified it as a problem, and then go talk. If you think you are solving a problem for somebody, it's probably useful to go talk to that somebody, right? If you're working in cystic fibrosis on a potential therapy for patients, go talk to some cystic fibrosis patients or cystic fibrosis clinicians, right? Like they'll tell you very quickly, I understand the value prop. Here's how big of the problem it is. Here's how much of a problem it is. They don't always know everything, but they can give you a really good idea, I think, and tell you whether your solution is feasible, right? Like there's plenty of technologies I've seen in academia where because of how a treatment is done or how a disease progresses, it's just not feasible. Like I think therapeutic predictions for oncology, great examples. People want to grow organoids or like take patient tissue, make predictions on what treatments to make. That works in some cancers. In some cancers, the cancer is so aggressive, you don't have the time. And so clinicians like, oh, that's really nice. The person's going to be dead by the time you come back with an answer. But I think this is a really good example of like, yeah, this is a cool idea. Works in some cases. Definitely know what cases it doesn't work in and what problem you're actually solving. So like, that's the sort of, I've meandered a little bit on the problem solving, but essentially the money side, right? There's more money. It moves faster because there's more money. You pay people more. I'd say the hours worked are roughly equivalent in my opinion. Although you have more freedom to sort of choose those hours and work within your schedule in academia, not because it's academia, but because academia operates at a smaller scale. There's often fewer people you're interacting with. On this sort of other part, this sort of, I think I've bled into this a little bit, like the problems to be solved and like the timelines. Because you're expected to return back capital in startups, right? There's a timeline to do so. VCs have an investment horizon. So you are trying to move faster and do things in a way that where it's like, here is our goal. Here are the things essential to, critical to, critical path is what we normally say to that goal. And then all these other adjacent things, they get done if there's time, if it's nice, they're 10% projects, although what Google recommends for like, or Google allows their engineers to do, right? They're extra stuff, but you have to follow critical path, which gives you less freedom to flex around and be like, oh, I wonder what that is, or I'm curious about the mechanism of this. Like, it does actually mean that you end up doing fewer of those experiments because your main goal is to spend as little as possible to get to this next milestone, which lets you then raise more capital or return value to shareholders in some way.
Yeah, this is a very good point that you are making. And that's interesting because it looks like money is a double-edged sword. From one side, it pushes forward the speed of scientific progress in general, because there is a return on investment that is expected. From the other side, I now talk a lot with people in the field of rare diseases, and there is no money there because it's not interesting from a commercial point of view. So it's like a very complex thing to look at.
Yeah. I will say, Maria, that there's never enough money. Like, it doesn't matter what field you're in, what you're doing. With a few key exceptions, maybe I being the exception right now, there's never enough money. And so I think in particular, like we could always dive into some of the dynamics of the market for rare disease. I think in Europe in particular, it's definitely tougher because of how the European healthcare system works. Although for the majority of people who don't have rare disease, the European healthcare system offers substantial benefits. So it's like, there's again a trade-off, like all things are trade-offs and you gain something and you lose something. In the US, there is a decent funding for rare disease, for some rare diseases. There's this huge there's sort of this qualitative equation, maybe an oxymoron, where it's like, it's a combination of the severity of the disease, how aware people are of it, as well as the patient size, sort of treatment progression, the sort of more clinical, more scientific things. And I have noticed is like, if you could get like something with really high profile, right? Like you look at like the ice bucket challenge with ALS, or like CF, cystic fibrosis is one of these examples, I think, where it's people are quite aware of it. It is probably the most prevalent rare disease among Caucasians. But it also has some really high profile representatives, right? It's like Boomer esiacin's son Gunnar esiacin has CF. And so Boomer, probably not very famous in Europe, but like in the US is famous football player. So a US football player, American football, not the true football. So like he had a very high profile platform to speak out on, in the same way, like there's a few other high profile actors, people who get these diseases, and that really springboards things into place. And you also see people who are patients who take their illness, I think, and become sort of representatives of the illness and patient advocacy. And that's also something that could really help a disease. It's a lot of work. Like they're doing a tremendous amount of work. It's exhausting, right? Having the disease and also being a representative, that can also really help an illness get funding in addition to just here's raw numbers and the market opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to business.
Yeah.
So you moved from academia to business. Was it a smooth journey for you?
No.
Or you understood that? Okay. Tell me.
No. It was not a smooth journey, in particular because, like, again, I'll do a little some criticism against academia, but I do think it's not just academia. I think that there's other challenges as well. One of them is sort of at the end of academia, at the end of my PhD, I was like, I know I don't want to go become a faculty member for a variety of reasons. One of them being like a timeline, the impact of your research seems so long. And I remember I was exploring sort of my third, fourth, fifth year, what options there were. And I landed on consulting, management consulting, in particular, strategy consulting. This isn't like I don't know if this is a widely known role. Like the biggest companies probably in the world that do strategy consulting are McKinsey, Bain, BCG. So these are like very household names. I did not go to one of the big three. I ended up going to life sciences strategy firm, which was amazing, which is ex-McKinsey folks and ex-Leerink Swan, so they're banking folks in life sciences and doing just life sciences. But the major firms do strategy consulting and eco management consulting across industries, right? You could work at tech, biotech, transportation and logistics, manufacturing. Like they're basically, they're brought in to help think about problems that, on the gracious side, like might require additional outside information or expertise the company doesn't have. And on the less gracious side, like it's a problem none of us want to think about or pick up or like don't have time to do. So we want some really smart people to come in and help us solve the problem. One of the things that comes out of management consulting is this usage of like frameworks, right? So it's like, how do we structure problems? And learning how to use frameworks, I would not claim to be an expert anyway, but like just sort of structuring out the problems was extremely helpful. It was one of those things where I think I had written in my lab notebook, I wish I had learned this at the beginning of graduate school, right? Because I could have structured my thesis, my PhD thesis, much better. Like if I had known how to use sort of frameworks in this way. And so I think that was a really valuable skill to learn. Again, I learned it through management consulting. People might learn it through other ways, but sort of how do you break a problem down into pieces of pieces and places you have information, you don't have information. How do you then explore that tree logically where it's like, okay, here are the different things that could be done. Here are the different things that we don't have information on. Here's indications that this is true versus this is true, right? Like that I think was super valuable. I ended up, like I said, going into management consulting at Clearview Healthcare Partners. They're ex-McKinsey folks, ex-Learning Swan folks. I did get interviews at all of the big three firms, and I flubbed every single final round interview. Like I could say with confidence, every single one of them I was just too anxious for. I used to be still moderately, I'm like a very anxious person. And I was like, okay, that happened. The Clearview folks were amazing. Like Steve Chow in particular, who's a partner there, was fantastic. Kevin, I think as well, I met, and they were like, we like you and the way you think. Do you want to come join us as a consultant? So I joined there and spent a year. And so this was the transition period, right? Where I'm going from academia into business. There are so many things you learn. And I had not done a PhD in human health, right? I was working very much on this like environmental and sort of like organism engineering frameworks or like sort of strategy. This was combination of a trial by fire for human health and business strategy. So I learned a lot about human health in slightly over the year I was there, as well as strategy, and it was a chance to see what problems do businesses really think or worry about. So we do strategy at the portfolio level at Clearview. Here is a set of problems for a specific indication. Do we want to take this asset forward or not, right? Like it's in early preclinical stages. It's in this specific disease. Is this something that we want to spend the money to actually take to market, like take through clinical trials and to FDA approval? And it was really eye-opening, right? It's like, here's how decisions are really getting made. Here is how people decide what to do and what not to do. I do remember thinking about the question. It's like, I don't, imposter syndrome. I was like, I don't feel super qualified to help make these decisions. Like I just came out of grad school. Like again, everyone at Clearview was like brilliant. And I do remember thinking like, am I being helpful? And like, why don't people in the companies who have all this information, make these decisions, right? They're within the company. They have more complete information about the situation than we do in many cases. Spoiler, it's because operations and strategy are two full-time jobs. I remember thinking that back then. I was like, oh, wow, like, why don't they do anything? Like, why aren't they able to do projects internally? Anyway, so we worked with amazing companies in the space. Like, so we worked with sort of like the top pharma companies you would expect. I can't give specific names, but then like biotech as well. I loved the people that I had worked with. Again, I loved Clearview. It was like amazing, great learning experience, trial by fire, and learning about, okay, these are actual problems to be solved. Here's how people make these decisions, these very hard decisions. And here's how like money flows through the system as well. So like we did not only therapeutics work, but also med tech, diagnostics work, pricing and market access, which is probably like one of the most interesting things if you want to like go learn about a place where systems barely work, pricing and market access in healthcare, like how drugs get paid for, how they get reimbursed, where the money flows. Like, I think part of the reason the system is so broken is because the majority of people don't understand how those things work. Like, and if you don't understand how they work, it's really hard to legislate. It's really hard to make policy decisions that make sense. Back to frameworks, right? Can you draw a map of the space even? I remember thinking like, this is insane. Like, how does the system work? And in particular for infectious disease, like the system was not working. So like you mentioned, rare disease has no money. Infectious disease and human health is like this woefully underfunded space. Like you have these reports like the UN report, right? The 10 million people will die from antibiotic resistance a year by I think it's 2050 or something. And just like no money or incentive to like push new antibiotic therapeutics out into the market. You have a bunch of people who are amazing trying to work on solving that. Happy to chat up, like, happy to sort of talk through like what I know there. But like, I remember seeing that and being like, this is such a broken system for such an urgently needed problem. So I had gotten really passionate about that while I was at Clearview. The one thing that I found really frustrating about consulting, and this is for folks who I'd say consider it, look at it for sure. It's a great next career step. You're not in the game. You go to a company, you do a project, you live that project for several weeks, right? Months even. You do the project, you hand over the final report or like the presentation, the recommendations to the client, and then you go, bye. Like for the partners, right? And the people who are sort of at the more senior level, they have continuing relationships and see what happened to these projects. But you as a consultant don't typically see the next step or the outcome, Maria. And that drove me crazy. The way I describe it is like, you're not in the game, right? It's like you're coming in, you're making a recommendation, you're above the game, watching it being played, but you're not in the game. And that I found so frustrating just as a person. So like I spent, I think a year and 3 months, 4 months at Clearview. Again, I love the people, but I was like, I want to actually do, like, I want to be in this game. And so I remember meeting a friend of mine at, I think it was a Little Donkey in Boston, Hamdi Kabasulu, amazing person. He was in the entrepreneurship space. He was helping run a nonprofit connecting, seasoned entrepreneurs to like startups coming out of academia so that they could start building executive teams, like seasoned exec teams. He, ADX, that was it. He was like, well, they're doing this fellowship at Yale where you got your grad work done, where you sit in the tech transfer office. So the tech transfer office, for folks who don't know, is the people who are patenting things coming out of the academic space, right? So faculty at the university have an invention, they'll sort of decide whether or not to patent it. If they have a patent, they'll then try to out-license that patent, usually to another company that can commercialize it, whether it's biotech or pharma and so forth. That's the historical model. I don't know all the ins and outs of the EU system, but in the US, I think this was all enabled by like the Bayh-Dole Act, where it used to be unclear who owned the IP if government funded the research. The government essentially was like, yeah, no, you can go and use this IP and sort of patent it and out-license it academia. And that sort of, I think in the 80s onward, resulted in an explosion of technological sort of innovation out of academia. And I think a lot of technological advancement. And so like people have criticisms of that space of like, they're like, industry is now too close to academia, right? It's like, there's criticisms, I guess, to be made, but I think that was part of the catalyst for that. And it has brought in more money from like external funders because they realize academia can do that kind of research, generate innovations that are directly applicable, alongside this sort of growth of the tech transfer offices. So I went back to Yale, I interviewed, I became a Biotech fellow, and that role was specifically to spin out startups. So like, you are a tech transfer person for startups. The faculty is like, I want this to be a startup instead of it being, out licensed to a bigger existing company. And the Biotech fellows get called in like, okay, let's see if this could be a startup. Like, we do an opportunity assessment on the market. We do like the technology, the market analysis. We do sort of like an idea of here's how much fundraising or work it would be, effort, money, and time to get to the next these milestones. We would pitch to VCs. We would find lab space in some cases. We sort of did literally anything and everything required to sort of help stand a startup up, decide if we should start a startup up, and to like stand an actual startup up. Great program. I think there's also one at Harvard, and Stanford has the Catalyst program. All these are great if you're like, you have some professional experience and you want to go into startups, but in particular, you don't have the financial situation in which you don't take a salary for a year because they pay you. So that was like an amazing experience. And like that, I think, was sort of second part of the eye-opening transition from academia to business. Now you're not just doing strategy, you're doing, right? It is now, if something, like I remember writing up strategies and be like, okay, cool. Oh no, now I have to go do the strategy. Like I look around the room, like I am the person. Oh, okay. And so this is where I was realizing, oh, okay, the reason it's so hard for folks within companies to often do this work is because strategy and operations work are not always, but often orthogonal to each other. So that's like you need to have time to do both and carve out time to do both, because you cannot, in most cases, I think, simultaneously do them. Maybe someone smarter than me can, but it's usually you need to have separate time for those.
Oh, that looks like an exciting journey. So I have like one option for a person who wants to transition from academia to business, become a consultant. Another one, to find this type of organization that can help, to spin off an academia invention into a startup. So which other options people have?
That's a good question. Excellent question. So if you're in the space where it's like, I want to get into, so let's separate that into two categories. One is I don't have an idea, and the other one is I do have an idea. And one is not necessarily better than the other, because your first idea or your idea you have is probably not viable. Not because you're bad, but from a statistical perspective, very few people pick the right idea the first, and very few, even fewer pick it the first time, right? just looking at the success rate numbers. So if you don't have an idea, there are a ton of, there's now, I think, a lot of really good programs out there to enable you to sort of get into the ecosystem in the space. Network matters a lot. So this is something that is true in academia and industry. Academia doesn't emphasize it as much, although you are building a network as you collaborate with your peers. I think industry is very network heavy, and it's not like, okay, a nepotistic, here's who you know, and you get a job automatically. But it's merely just like if humans are in a gigantic bottle and there's stochastic interactions happening, right? And a subset of those molecules or people in that bottle that you could randomly bump into could help you get to the next step. By default, the more people you interact with, the more likely you are to find that person or to get into that, to interact with that person. So this is like more of the importance of the network. So I think finding roles that allow you to network build as well as sort of formulate and evaluate ideas are the most useful. Roles like I mentioned the Biotech fellowship, particularly I think Harvard's has changed now, but Yale's is always you're not tied to a specific project. So I worked at Yale with 8 faculty. I think I got 5 startups off the ground. It's a year-long fellowship, if I remember correctly. And so you, at the end of the year, you jump into one of the startups you helped create. So there's like an operator role waiting for you. So that's what I did. We can punt that for now. But the sort of that place, like accelerators are also a really good place to go. Like incubator, accelerator. I think you get to see a wide swath of the ecosystem, meet a lot of the people, see a wide swath of startups, help them. Really good, I think, next steps. I like management consulting. I would say that I think a lot of people go into startups immediately after grad school. I think that is fine. I do think we don't appropriately prepare people for that jump because they're like, I'm going to do it on my research, and they don't necessarily have all of the skills, and it's sometimes very hard. Some people do, some people don't. But those kinds of roles where you get to work within the ecosystem, helping startups, and then forming startups, venture creation, I think all of those are really good starting roles if you don't have an idea. And then your night job is to go network with people. So you grow the network and you meet with more folks, you learn about ideas, and you start to think, okay, where are their needs? And then we can sort of talk about startup strategy after that, formulating, testing hypotheses. But if you do have an idea, I would say go try to kill the idea, right? It's this is where it's if you've got an idea, there's a lot of programs now, gosh, Berkeley has the WISE program for women. And then who else is there out there? There's a ton of fellowships out of VC, really early stage pre-seed VC. I think Pear VC has one. Gosh, who else has one? You can sort of Google, or if you start meeting VCs, they'll mention, okay, there's these venture creation or venture fellowships where we'll support you with $100K for a year. You go explore the idea. And then you decide whether or not we want to launch a startup. So those, I think, if you have a specific idea to go try and knock down, are great. And like I said, try to kill the idea as quickly as possible, because again, from a pure statistical perspective, even for smart people, the odds that you've picked the right idea the first time are not high. And so going back to both of these scenarios, you now have this idea. What do you do with it? Your goal is to try to understand as much as possible about the market for that, right? What is the specific problem that you are solving? What is the problem? How are you solving that problem as succinctly as possible? Who is that benefiting, right? And then who is going to pay? And I separate those out because there's a user and then there's a customer, a payer. And those are in a lot of situations not always the same person, particularly if you're working in the business to business world. And so then once you have a set of sentences about that, you can write out sort of your unknowns, right? I am guessing that people have this problem. I'm guessing they solve it today this way. I'm guessing it takes them this many hours, right? And you have these lists. Okay, what are those list of questions seems like the one that's most likely to kill your idea, which are the top 3. You then take those questions, find a dozen people who you think are customers or users, ask them those questions, and just, as neutrally as possible, not hey, so I'm guessing that you do this and this and this right now today, right? Your question you ask them unbiased is what kind of problems do you face in work? Okay, cool. Did they list your problem? I mean, if not, that's already a little bit of data, but sometimes it can be recency bias. And then you go to the next step of like, okay, how much time or frustration do each of these problems take? And then third, what have you tried to do to solve these problems? Right? Is it just like, okay, I need to gripe about something? Or is it like, no, I've tried 4 things and none of them have worked, but I've adopted one of them as a stopgap solution or kind of works. A lot of this work, a lot of these idea thinking comes from this book called I think it's The Mom Test. There's 2 great books here.
Yeah.
Talking to Humans, which is like a free ebook, but you can also purchase a copy of it. And then The Mom Test, which are sort of product development books that have been quite good, at least in my opinion. But you can test these on things that are not even product, or you can use these on things that are not even products yet. They can be used on ideas. The goal is just how do you not bias your interviewee? And this is where, I know people make fun of social sciences as being like not as hard of a sciences. These skills are the exact skills you'll often learn in social sciences. And so they're incredibly valuable. So folks, in the social sciences, like you are very useful. You already have a lot of the skills to start a company and to launch products. Definitely don't feel excluded because you haven't done like as much of a technical PhD in like physics or math or biology or chemistry or anything like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also you need to not to be too charmed with your idea. Yeah, not to be biased. Yeah, not to nudge people into telling you what you want to hear. So to be very critical as a scientist.
Yeah, and it's super hard. Like I still bias people in conversations. It happens. That's okay. But to avoid it as much as possible.
Yeah. And then you went from helping startups to launch. Yeah, you then started your own startups.
Yes. So this came out of the Biotech fellowship. And to rewind quickly, because I love telling sitting tales. If you can't tell, Maria, I love telling. Please stop me, by the way, if any of these get too long. When I was in grad school, I worked on this project for the Jurassic Park problem. As part of that work, somebody, I think at DARPA, or there's somebody in the biosecurity community became aware of my work. And I like to joke that I'm pretty sure that they were slightly concerned about the work. They were like, oh, this person might be a biosecurity concern and they're engineering organisms. And so they pulled me onto this fellowship called the Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity. It's run through Johns Hopkins University, Center for Health Security. And so it's like a networking fellowship, a really amazing experience in retrospect, because I hadn't known a lot about it beforehand. But I was like, okay, yeah, I think this is a really valuable thing. It brings together policy folks, research scientists, and people in like military sort of first response to ask to sort of discuss biosecurity. This was in 2018, before biosecurity was cool / pandemics were like widely, like people knew that they could happen, but there was not this awareness with COVID. And so I was on this fellowship, and this is where I started, again, I was learning this sort of in consulting, this pricing market access dynamics in infectious disease and this not working. And then biosecurity, I was learning about all these problems and like in microbiology, virology. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a huge problem. Like I need to do something here. So when I came into the Biotech, one of the things I asked for was like, I want all of your infectious disease projects. Like I want to start a startup here. And they were like, okay, tough market, but like, here they are. So I worked a lot on like our vaccine projects, on our like antibiotics projects. And one of the projects that I worked on was the technology that led to Felix Biotechnology, which was the company that I helped spin out of Yale and joined after the fellowship. And the whole premise of that was we wanted to develop phage therapy. So bacteriophages are viruses of bacteria. They can infect bacteria. They don't infect human cells. And so you get this like enemy of my enemy is in my friend approach, where you can use a little, how people argue whether it's living, it's self-replicating, a little self-replicating thing, and you can give it to a person and it can clear the bacteria. And they have this benefit of being very specific, right? So you could target one thing and remove it and like leave the rest of the microbiome intact, which can be really valuable because broad spectrum antibiotics do a lot of collateral damage. Yeah. And so I came into the project. We're doing phage therapy particularly looking at cystic fibrosis, Pseudomonas infections. So these are lung infections with patients who have CF. They have changes in the lung structure, results in increased infections because they're permanently colonized with Pseudomonas, eventually leads to their decline in ability to breathe and they pass away. And so the phage has a really interesting history. I started in Eastern Europe, right? There's a bunch of centers there still in Eastern Europe where you can get phage therapy treatments. And never really caught on in the West. We adopted broad spectrum antibiotics, like small molecules. So you have this divergence, and there's always been this suspicion of like, does phage therapy work because it came out of a different place? It's had this history where you run a clinical trial, phage do pretty phenomenally on safety, right? It's like phage get made on the bacteria that is the infectious agent a lot of times, so you have to filter it really well. So you just have the bacteriophages and none of the nasty stuff from the bacteria. But they do amazing on safety, like no safety signal, no issues as far as we can tell. They fail every trial on efficacy. So like people have run trials. Nestle ran a major trial. Queen Astrid Military Hospital ran a major trial. They've never shown efficacy. And so that was like the bar to clear. And the team had gotten some initial funding to get a clinical trial done, like a phase 1-2 clinical trial in academia done, but they had no one to write the documents to get the trial, sort of, we call it a safe to proceed, but people like to say approved, the trial is approved by the FDA. And so they needed someone to write the IND, the investigational new drug application. And so I was like, I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to figure it out. And so I helped write the person who typed the IND, the best way to describe that. So like I worked with a clinician who was going to be the primary investigator on the trial. I worked with the clinical trial center at Yale. I worked with like a constellation of folks, like the phage experts like Ben Chan and Paul Turner, to get that IND written. And then the company, Felix, already had a CEO, so he'd already spun out. So Rob also helped a lot in putting together, like getting the material needed for those documents. It took us like 8 months to a year, but we got a safe to proceed from the FDA and we ran that trial like on a very shoestring budget. But yeah, like that was the thing that was needed. And at the end of that, like fellowship, I was like, this is the company I want to join. Like I had a couple of other offers that seemed viable and I did like them, but more than anything, I wanted to see if I could make a difference in infectious disease. And so I joined Felix as their head of BD and sort of also interim head of clinical because I had already done a lot of like the clinical work. We had this phase 1-2 trial running. It was a slog, right? It's like I had mentioned earlier, there's not money in infectious disease. It is so hard to raise money in infectious disease. Like you'll go to folks and they're like, we understand it's a problem. It's a huge problem. Like we feel for you. If we invest in you or we partner with you, we give money to this, our shareholders would kill us because like there's no money in this space. And the quick backtrack, although do give me a time check, 2 things happening there. One of them is this pricing and market access dynamic. A lot of antibiotics are given in the inpatient setting. So like a person is checked into the hospital, this is where you get the wristband, and you're in the hospital, you stay there. The way the US reimburses for inpatient setting, it's basically here's a pool of money based on what happened to you and what they're treating. You don't get any extra money if you use something that works better, right, per se. And so there's this huge pressure to just use, here's the cheap generic antibiotic that might work. The second problem is that physicians are like, oh, there's a new antibiotic. Let's like hold it over here and hide it because like we want it to work every time we give it. And we only give it in like scenarios where we absolutely must. So you have this double whammy where it's like hospitals won't make, like they literally will lose money if they give a new antibiotic. Like they'll become insolvent if they continuously did this. And then you have physicians who don't want to give it. And these dynamics sunk 3 antibiotics companies the year before we launched. So Occasion went down because they got a drug to market. They got FDA approval the years it took to do that. They tried to sell the drug, couldn't make enough money, went bankrupt, got sold for parts. Melinta also went under that same year. And I think there was one more that also did not succeed. Like they all in the span of a year or 2 became insolvent, failed as companies. And so there's like understandably a lot of concern there. So like Rob and I worked to raise money dilutively and non-dilutively. We did grants, whatever we could do. And, just to extend, like, can we keep this trial running? Can we build a pipeline? But I think, when I left Felix, one of my biggest lessons was like, you can't solve policy problems with market solutions in most cases, right? Like if the problem is policy is broken, creating a for-profit entity will probably not help you unless you are using it to take advantage of a policy loophole. Like there are ways you can make money off policy things, but you need to know which way that wind blows. And in this case, it was like, again, fighting headwinds because there is so much fear of the space not being able to make a shareholder money.
Oh, yeah, that's tough because there are so many talks around that antibiotic resistance and everything. Yeah, we haven't seen a single new antibiotic, and it's not because science cannot do that, but just because the industry, like in the policies, are structured in a way that nobody who should be interested in it is interested in it. Spectacular. Wow.
It's rough. I think if you're looking for folks to talk to / follow in that space, we're still fighting the good fight. I think Kevin Adderson and Aaron Duffy run and I can't remember I think Rick Bright might be the third guy. They run Carbex. So like people recognize in the policy space that there's an issue here. And so they're trying to stand up these incentives. We call them push and pull incentives. Push, get things through the pipeline from the start. Pull is like you create a market incentive. Carbex is one of those push incentives trying to do early stage R&D. Like, so Carbex would be the place I'd go, talk to them. I think they were a little wary on phage. I think that they do have some conservatism around like the approaches that they take. That has since evolved. I've looked at their portfolio since then and they've branched out. And then BARDA does the later stage work. And then, or AMR Action Fund. I can't remember the name of the gent there. He's ex-Boehringer or Ingelheim. But there's a couple of really good folks at AMR Action Fund. On the pull side, there's been some interesting work by the UK to do like a Netflix style model for antibiotics, where like they pay just to have it on formulary. And that looks like it could be promising. Again, time will tell. I haven't checked the space in a little bit, but that seemed to have been going well when I had stopped working in the space. And John Rex is the person I'd follow because he does a lot of sort of policy talk about antibiotics, antibiotic resistance. And so like those are folks sort of just in the top of my mind that are very in the know in the space and trying to make policy change. I'm sure there are more folks I'm forgetting, but I'm always happy to share like a list. But I talked to some of these folks and I remember one of them, like, I don't think anyone I listed, but I talked to like, this is like the situation. Like, I wouldn't call this a success, right? Like as a founder, did I fail, right? Did I not ensure the company succeeded? Do I keep going in this because I feel passionate about this? And one of them was like, Natalie, you don't have to kill your career over this, right? Like there's just not money here. Go elsewhere, get the skills, and you can always come back to this space. I was like, oh, that is a really interesting insight. So, I'm always, again, very grateful to the folks who are willing to give me advice and sort of took that advice to then jump to the next thing.
Yeah, and now you are at Deep Origin, where you are using AI, very, very hot topic these days, to improve the R&D process of drug development. So what are the most promising, from your point of view, use cases for AI in biology except drug development?
Except drug development.
Yes.
Oh boy, that's like, let me think about that question for a little bit. Like, I think so I would first off classify myself as somewhat of an AI skeptic. I think lots of people are very excited about AI and in particular machine learning based approaches to do things. I think that in a lot of cases, there's just not enough data available to do machine learning approach things in biology. Like the required data points that you typically would need are like 10 to the 9th onward. Like this is like 1 billion data points or more. We don't get like the cost per data point in life sciences is absurd compared to the cost per data point in tech, right? Or training on natural language where you have the corpus of the internet or all these cat videos or pictures. Like, not to dismiss ImageNet and like the work that I can't have I think Stacey Lee, like phenomenal work, critical work for the machine learning space. The cost to generate a single accurate data point and know how accurate it is in biology is probably multiple orders of magnitude more expensive. And
it's not still there is not enough data. Yeah.
So that's the reason there's not enough data, Maria. And I think the other thing is people are making these methodologies to generate sort of noisy data. Like, okay, we'll sacrifice quality and get quantity. Maybe someone creates machine learning advances that then will help address that. I don't know if that works, right? Because if you have machine learning is essentially fancy statistics. You're running a fancy statistics process. So ultimately you're just looking at signal to noise ratios, right? And if your noise increases, but your signal has to increase at a higher rate in order for you to get an actual signal out of that noise. If they're just increasing it equally, right? Your model is not going to be able to distinguish those things very well. And therefore you then need more orders of magnitude, more data to try and separate out that signal to noise ratio. So I'm not optimistic about us having enough data to solve some really critical problems. Like, I know people are very enthusiastic about protein structure being solved. I think that actually is a place we have made really good advancements. Like AlphaFold has been tremendously valuable. I will say that there's a difference between having a static structure of a protein and being able to use that as a therapeutic program. Like there's a great paper by Mark Mirko called Structure, and his co-author, whose name I can't remember, I'm sorry. Structure is beauty, but not always truth, right? Which speaks to this argument of we get these static structures. This is amazing. It is a breakthrough, but how much can we do with them that actually moves forward drug development? But coming back to your question, so there's this not enough data question. There's also this, there's the body of data out there. It often doesn't have the accompanying labels or metadata you would want to train on it. So you talk to people, the biggest pain is okay, now you have to take all these data points and clean them somehow. And that's a manual process. The data not having the metadata means that I think in many ways, it doesn't matter how much machine learning you could do on it. There's nothing to make an inference on or an accurate inference on. And so those are truly the big challenges I see in machine learning, or in using AI in biology. The places that it probably would be more useful is the places that you already see it sort of being used elsewhere. It's summary of literature. There are definitely some issues where, there's the models will hallucinate, they won't interpret correctly. A big question, I think, is who do you consider an expert source of information or data, right? It's when you train, how do you label, the guy on Quora giving some shady advice about home pregnancy care versus a clinician who's an OBGYN, right? Or a midwife. They're different quality of information. I think there are some questions there, but broadly, we're generating so much information, and before LLMs came on the scene, it was a big problem. No one could keep up with the literature. You can look up a graph of how many publications there are. Yeah, okay, you could see 20% of them are still junk publications, falsified, etc. There's still a huge increase in research being done. How do you keep up with that? How do you summarize that? So sort of being an aid to people in this way is, I think, probably where you'll see AI help the most. And the second thing is tool usage. So there's a huge barrier to entry for a lot of the tools that we use in life sciences and biology. And if you think about it, Maria, we spend 8 years training somebody to go into this space, right? That's a huge cost. Can we get people up to speed faster? Can we get them productive faster on these tools? And so that's where we've sort of focused, is we've built a couple of agents to assist with that. One of them that is closed beta right now is Balto, named after a dog. It's supposed to be sort of your human, your dog based, your puppy assistant for using these tools, doing these literature searches, understanding the space. But there are other folks doing great work in the space as well, right? There's the folks at Future House with Has Anyone and Paper QA. There's folks at CZI, Chan Zuckerberg, who are working on this. There are folks at Genentech working on this. I think Aviv has been very forward about the interest of Genentech in this space. I think that the low-hanging fruit, though, is not building these biology-specific things so much as it is helping the human, because we can rely on the corpus of data from elsewhere that is not biology.
Mm-hmm. And there is also an issue with hallucinating models, as far as I know, in general in life sciences. So scientists say, how can we be sure that the data that we receive from AI, yes, is reliable?
So this is a really interesting point that I think is an unmet need in the space, is creation of benchmarks, right? Because it's trust is an issue. And I think that that's a really critical thing to bring up. The benchmarks that people are creating benchmarks, but I think sort of a creation of an entity, whether that's like a nonprofit, a governing body, something where it's like, here is a set of benchmarks that we have vetted and adopted because they are being created, but like no one is pushing certain ones to the forefront. Again, like I know some of the folks at Future House, so I'm aware that they put together a lab benchmark, which is a set of questions in biology, multiple choice, if I remember correctly. Again, to test whether the reasoning is sound. There's still this question or fear of hallucination. There are mechanisms that you can go online and look at for like the standard AI assistants or like standard open AI, ChatGPT, Gemini. You can query them in certain ways that reduces hallucination rate. But I think ultimately this is one of like the problems that we do need to solve to increase trust in these things. And so we've worked on a few proprietary things here at Deep Origin to address this problem with Balto and some of our other tools. And then the last thing will probably just end up being time, right? It's like when search engines came about, how many people felt like search engines were not going to give useful information, right? Like, or turn the wrong information up, right? Like this is, over time, we learned not just to trust the search engine, but how to use the search engine to find what we need and evaluate which things were trustworthy versus not. So I think that will probably be ultimately what happens with these assistants is we'll learn how to use them, where they work well, where they're not, and we'll build tools to reduce the risk of hallucination, increase trust.
Everything needs and requires time.
Yeah. Very definitely.
I've read that there is a difference between the traditional process of drug development, which relies on the laws of physics, and doing that with AI. So this is my silly, stupid question. What do you do with physics in drug development?
No, that is not a silly question at all. I think this is actually not widely known information. So physics has been used in drug development since like the 60s. So there's like this article you can look up where it's a computational drug discovery at like Merck and Company, and there's this like magazine cover with like this model on it. Basically everything ultimately is like a physical process, right? So it's like at the molecular level, what you're trying to do is have a small molecule or an antibody, a protein, interact with another usually protein, but sometimes other thing within the body, and cause it to change its function, usually break it. Like creating an inhibitor for something is like the thing that is most commonly done. And so they're having interactions in the same way you have like sort of at the chemical level, or for people who remember like orbitals and sp, like atoms interacting with each other. That's ultimately what they're doing. They're interacting in some way, and you want to create something that sticks really well into a part of that protein that changes its function. And so you can actually create models of these things. And we have for many decades created models of these proteins with these small molecules and ask the question of, is this potentially going to be a good drug? And it all boils down to this question of, you can make a bunch of molecules. I think there's a 10 to the 60th possible small molecules. Which of them should you make? Right. And historically, we've relied on medicinal chemists, and they will think about it, draw structure, make that at the bench, and then we go test it in lab. The sort of promise that came about with sort of computational chemistry and like the use of physics and chemistry, the computational chemistry in these spaces was, can you model that? Can you do that virtually? And so instead of, making the molecule, you draw the structure in the computer and you have it sort of go into the pocket. This is very simplified. But I'm happy to dive into deeper some of this. Also probably great to speak to some of like the experts. I am like our CSO, Garrick Papoyan, has been tenured distinguished faculty member here at University of Maryland for decades. But essentially you ask the question of, okay, based on what you know about physics and chemistry, will these things be attracted to each other, right? Do you see a drop in the energy of the system if they are actually interacting with each other? And then you use that to try and make inferences of like, okay, here are the molecules we should make out of the 10 to the 60th. And then you can go test those in experiment. So very much a lot of it is, how do we narrow the field of things we should do by testing more things in a different system? Now, in many cases, these tools haven't worked, right? But in some cases they have. And there are some methodologies that have actually, I think, gotten widespread adoption, like free energy perturbation from Schrodinger. Schrodinger has really, I think, sort of paved the way for us in some ways, Maria. Like they are a phenomenal company based on physics. Now developing their own drugs, but they still do offer software. there's other companies that have also sort of done a lot of this work, like Atomwise. So Atomwise was doing like sort of a different technology, docking and virtual screening. Schrödinger has done like molecular dynamics and free energy perturbation. D.E. Shaw Research, again, another example. So like there are definitely people before us who have done this kinds of work. And I think the main challenge has always been it's incredibly computationally intensive, and you must know first principles about your system. So the math that we use to solve these systems is all approximation. Like there hasn't been like a true representation of the system where I'll just sort of like, that looks good enough. Okay, we'll run it this way and see if we get an answer. And of course, when you make approximations, your system becomes inaccurate. So that's also where the sort of key limitation has been.
So in fact, what happens, like I've recently read about how Google tried for 7 years to give AI a robotic body, and they followed the same path. First, they had like robotic arms that were trying to grasp objects 1,000 times per day. Then they understood that with this frequency, it will take decades before AI will learn. That's why they had to move it to the digital space, emulating, the reality with some approximation, giving this object some properties, and teaching AI on a larger scale to do that like millions times per day,
Each one's a data point.
Yes, exactly. To get more data points faster. So this is practically how AI improves and builds, on top of this, laws of physics to make the drug development process faster and more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and apologies, I had to plug my computer in so everyone gets to see more of the mess that is our house. But that's exactly like the thing that you're talking about, Maria. You've hit on like the value proposition of machine learning and in particular AI. It's like in physics, if you know first principles, you can build and then derive the system and solve the system, right? In a world where you don't know what the principles, the laws governing the system are in total, where you can't make accurate approximations, you can use machine learning with large numbers of data points to actually make inferences instead. And so these two systems complement each other. And so I think that's probably like for Deep Origin, the place we see the most value is like, can we thoughtfully combine these two approaches to create better, more accurate drug discovery engines? And so that's sort of like what we've been very focused on, in addition to this concept, as I mentioned earlier. It's like a lot of the data doesn't have metadata, right? Like the data collection and keeping that with your metadata is a huge problem. It's an infrastructure problem, and there's not really a clear unified infrastructure for all of this, or unified system to enable us to do, more machine learning, to do this kind of work. So we've also like focused very heavily on building an infrastructure for biotech companies that want to be AI first, to be like, here's something you can adopt, right? And this allows you to, out of the box, have most of the things that you would need. You don't have to worry about building it yourself, which is definitely, Recursion did that. A lot of the big companies initially did that because there were not good options. But the goal is to have a unifying system so they don't have to focus on infrastructure, which is a huge load and burden. If you don't do it right, like you can't actually do machine learning. You can't actually you can't actually achieve the goal you set out to do, which is often like discover a drug by machine learning or any other means, right? So it's like that infrastructure, I think, is a critical underappreciated piece of the puzzle as well. So I know that like we might be talking to Michael as well. Spoilers for folks on the podcast. We might be talking to Michael, the CEO and my co-founder, the founder of Deep Origin.
So I'm already noting down the questions. Which I would love to ask you both. And now, since we are already trying to run over, I still want to ask you about terraforming and space travel. This is, I think, like the topic, that we definitely need to talk about.
Yes, happy to talk about terraforming. So going back to the story I'd mentioned with Drew Endy, so I went to a Gordon conference. Drew Endy is a famous synthetic biologist. He helped found iGEM. He's at, I think, Stanford Biodesign Institute, Department of Biodesign. Sorry, Drew. He and I had this conversation on a mushroom foray, and during one of the Gordon conference breaks, and he asked me what I sort of wanted to do with my life, and I had mentioned this frustration. Another question he'd asked me is like, what are you really passionate about? Like what subject area, right? And I remember telling him, he was like, I think it's important humans go to space. So I think, just applied to, or was just about to apply to the US Astronaut Corps. I got rejected. I didn't even get an interview. So like, don't get excited, but I think I have the rejection printed out somewhere. So I knew that. I was like, I think it's important from a perspective of like, when you study environmental science, you study sort of like the history of the environment as well. And like massive extinction events are not that infrequent. I'm probably going to give you the wrong number if I try to here, but for some reason there's 300,000 years is like, there's an extinction event of some kind. And major extinction events are, I think, on the scale of millions of years. Like if we think humans are valuable, right? Like let's say we are the only sentient life in the universe. Like it seems valuable to move that out beyond just a single planet. Like better to have more than one backup, basically. Even if you're not the only sentient life in the universe, if you think there's intrinsic value to sentient life. I think arguments can be made against this as well. So A City on Mars was a book published by Zach and Kelly Wiener-Smith, which I think is actually a very well thought through treatise on this that makes some good counter arguments, worth reading and evaluating. But overall, like in the long arc of time, I think that's probably still a valuable thing. And so I was like, I think that's important. Humans go to space. I want to help humans thrive in space, because Drew was like, you need biology for that, right? Like right now we rely mostly on chemistry and physics to keep astronauts alive in the ISS, but like that's because they're in like the very nice umbilical cord areas of the Earth, right? You can still get resources to them. Anytime you have a self-sustaining colony, you're going to need biology, because biology is good at keeping biology alive. Like you can create these sort of closed ecosystems. And so I was like, that is what I want to do. He's like, you should build Drew was like, you should build biotech for space. We're going to need it. And I was like, I want to be able to, for us to construct ecosystems, right? Like microbial or otherwise, like what are the ecosystems that can be used to recycle and reuse the basic elements that we put into that system. So sort of microbial ecosystems to renew the elements of life. I looked around and there's not a market for this, Maria. Like there's not going to be a market for this for like 40 or 50 years. So part of the reason I wanted to sort of learn to build biotechs was like, if the opportunity arises for me to found that kind of startup, right, I want to be able to give it the maximum chance of survival. And if you look at everyone who's worked in the space industry, pretty much everyone else has de-risked themselves and made stupid sums of money elsewhere, right? You can look at Bezos, Musk, etc., right? This is the pathway. It's like you become a titan and then you get to go to space and you get to work in space. So I was like, okay, I have to sort of make my mark or money or experience elsewhere. But I remained really interested in terraforming, and as a sort of result of that, have connected with various groups over the years, thinking about this question of, how biology can help. So we published this Nature Biotech paper a few years ago with Shannon Nangle, Mark Zisak, a few other folks, about the case for biotech on Mars, which goes through a framework of, if I remember correctly, 5 things that biotech can be useful for, whether it's creating therapeutics, closing the loop on ecosystems, right, recycling nutrients, creating food, creating building materials. I can't remember what the 5th one was. Apologies. But I think it's probably making life, like environments, more amenable, right? So it's like you could put it out there, you can have it break down things, you can have it modify the environment. And so we sort of had put together this idea of, there are many ways biology can be useful. What are technologies we should start building now for that 50 to 100 year timeline where we will likely go out beyond just the comfort of Earth? Most folks have focused on Mars. I'm not like tied specifically to Mars. I think each planet presents its own problems, as does like intergenerational shifts that don't involve you terraforming a specific planet. But the other work I think that's really useful to sort of know about is that there are folks who are working on figuring out microbes specifically to modify the environment of Mars. So Pioneer Bio, which is Erica Alden de Benedictis, or de Benedictis Alden. Sorry, Erica. I'm not always great with names. She founded Pioneer Labs. They're here at NBC, and they're working on the first microbe for Mars. And this is in conjunction with like sort of a focused research org setup. So like they don't have, for folks who are not familiar with focused research orgs, there are sort of like a for-profit structure for a nonprofit. So they have a specific timeline to spend down money to solve a specific problem, but there's not a motive or requirement to return capital so it's a really interesting model, I think, to solve these scientific problems that are beyond the scope of academia and can't be solved by industry. They're building the first microbe for Mars and dealing with sort of all the problems of how do microbes survive on Mars. They're a great group to sort of follow, but I advise and sort of meet with them from time to time to sort of stay in this space and provide whatever I can do to be useful. I think I'm learning more from them than they are from me. And then Edwin Kite at UChicago has also sort of helped out, I think, a lot in thinking about terraforming, Maria. And he and his team have come up with a way that we think we can feasibly heat Mars. So one of the biggest challenges is the temperature is extremely low. Temperature being low is not necessarily problematic, but it means that water is frozen as ice, and you need water for life. And so he and the sort of his team there have come up with a proposal, at least a model for something I think will warm Mars using mostly in situ resources. So this is not throwing nukes at Mars, which could create a set of problems itself. But I think that's actually a viable plan that we could try. We then run into the question of, who has the right to modify Mars, right? This is where you run into sort of legal and policy things, and there is a gap here. There are people working in the space. But I think coming up with some kind of agreement or framework in the same way we need this for Earth, right? Like if we have climate change is going to be a global scale thing. We need to create global scale mitigations as well as solutions. I'm made pessimistic that we can reduce enough. I think we will have to take an active intervention. Who gets to decide whether we're seeding the oceans with iron to increase algal growth or we're trying to spray aerosols to reflect sunlight, right? Like who gets to make those decisions and how do they get made? These are really big policy questions that like scientists can come up with technologies, but in the absence of a framework to implement them, they just sort of sit there on the shelf. And this is not something where I'd say like a for-profit entity can operate as well because there's so much liability that a lot of for-profit entities aren't going to touch these large interventions. You get like startups that will do like, oh, we'll do carbon capture or like something like that. I think these larger interventions will often like not get funded or die because the investors look at that and they're like, there's a huge amount of risk here, right? From government coming in and shutting you down. So I think that's a big gap in the space globally, right? Like the US probably the US should not decide this on its own, right? Like there needs to be a conversation between the US, the EU, like the African nations, Australia, like Asia, like all of them have to be part of this process. But figuring that out, like shit has happened, pardon my language, like it has gotten bad. Okay, what of these things can we and should we do? And how do we distribute the gains or the benefits from that system, right? Like who is gonna like do we save Vanuatu that's losing all of its land from the sea level rising, right? Is there a different intervention that we do that saves other things? Like these are really, really, really hard questions that I'm very grateful I don't have to solve. But like the framework for like deciding what we do on Mars at a planetary scale feels like a lower stakes version of that because people's lives and livelihoods are not as involved in those. Whereas on Earth, I think there's a lot there. So like you could use that as like an early framework to like, okay, we make decisions at a planetary scale here in this system. Can we then take that and use it on Earth to sort of make Earth scale decisions and like build out that system? I don't know if it would work. This is just sort of my meandering thoughts on terraforming. This is the sort of thing I like to think about in my spare time is like, can we build a system for humans that will help humans continue to thrive on Earth? I don't think ideally we're not, if we've lost Earth, we're in a very bad timeline, like very, very bad. We should avoid that at all costs. There is no planet B, as people would also say, as normally say, but like also build a sort of future where we are moving beyond Earth to see what else is out there as a natural exploratory species. And I think continuing the evolution of humans themselves.
Do you think that there is evolution of human as a species? Will it be with gene editing? Will it be with implants? Will it be with robotics?
All the above. I think humans are, if anything, like we can be very suspicious of new technologies, but very often we're enthusiastic adopters of tools. That's what brought us to where we are today. Like We are prolific tool users, and the question of like, are my glasses a implant or a prosthetic? Is this a prosthetic, right? Essentially, glasses are a prosthetic. Like, it's widely adopted at this point. You know, at the beginning, there was probably arguments made about this being an affront to God or some other higher power because we were being selected out of the gene pool or something. And as a result of glasses, people who have poor vision do survive longer, right? It's like there is a trade-off that's happened there, right? I do think that we will continue to adopt and use those things. Again, going back to ethics, I think we have to weigh cost benefit, right? So you have like people like, I think the guy in China who his last name is Hu, who CRISPR edited babies for like fetuses who were born into babies, who the outcome or the return on that, like the benefit of that was questionable. The technology maturity was questionable, as well as the return, that the actual experiment, like, was this going to help them avoid HIV, was questionable. I think those are sort of things that probably will happen again. Like, how do we deal with those? How do we, again, put together, going back to frameworks, I like frameworks, like, what are the situations in which we're like, this is acceptable to intervene versus not? Because a blanket, this is never acceptable to intervene with gene editing, probably not going to fly, right? Like, it's not going to work super well, because people, once they see the benefit of a tool, will want to try and use it. Banning things outright, you know, historically has not gone well. You can look at many examples in history of that. But, you know, how do we want to govern that? And then these additional things like robotics and so forth. I have to be a little skeptical that we're going to upload our consciousnesses to like the singularity. I am also not super well versed in that space, so like I don't think I can speak with much education to it. I do think that there's a lot of challenges there biologically to doing so, not just on the technological side. But I do think that there's going to be increasing sort of like human machine interfaces and like expansion out beyond the like, I've got a mouse, like a thing, and I'm going to poke out the screen, right? Like, that's where we are today. There probably will be more than that coming in the next 20 years, Maria. So exciting, but also like, you know, there will be terrifying things as well.
Yeah.
Not to end things on a sad note. There will be wonderful things as well.
Okay, so last question and a wonderful thing. Your dream,
Of course.
Dream technology biotech project that you would love, dream problem that you would love to solve.
Oh, yeah. So going back to the microscope, there's a dream problem out there, which I think if we were to say like my lofty ambition, Maria, is like this: can you build these enclosed ecosystems through new elements of life, right? These microbial consortia, and like science suggests that it's possible. Like, that's what I would love to dedicate my life to, sort of once I've sort of figured out business and sort of set up a company to do that, to help people do that. I'm deeply interested. I don't know if I'm the most useful scientist at the bench anymore. But back to like a more mundane thing. So I bought a microscope partly to do science because I miss science, but partly because I'm chronically ill. So I've had a chronic infection for the last 4 or 5 years. I didn't mention this, but while I was helping start Felix back in 2019, I got a urinary tract infection. It persisted like through multiple rounds of antibiotics through the pandemic. It seems to have not quite ever really gone away. We don't know. The clinicians that I work with like don't really know what's going on. We haven't gotten a good answer for like, is it even the same organism, right? And this is like despite the fact that, you know, they're doing testing, they're not doing nothing. But because the way the healthcare system is set up, we can't get very good information on what this thing is and like what's actually causing these recurrent infections. And like urinary tract infections like sound like they're very mundane, right? You look at the symptoms, you're like, that sounds like it sucks, but it's not going to like be life threatening. They are often like things that cascade. Like, so when you're older in particular, you're more immunocompromised, they'll often like drive a cascade of like system shutdowns and like organ failure and death, right? So like this is a risk. It's also a risk to fertility. So like there's real challenges here. It's been an unsolved problem. So part of the reason I bought the microscope is because I can literally, for lack of a better word, image my pee, right? And be like, what is going on there, right? It's like, what is actually present in the samples versus not. I have a friend at Berkeley who is actually going to help me with like sequencing as well. And hopefully I didn't just out him. I offered to pay for it multiple times, but he is also going to get like a clinical sample out of it, I think. I gave him like full consent. I was like, here you go. I have full knowledge of what this could be used for. Like, please, like, take this, because like, yeah, we don't know what's going on. And like, again, the healthcare system is not set up to actually help in a case like this. So yeah, that is, I want to solve one thing in the near term time frame. It's figure out what's going on there so I can help myself very selfishly. But then if we can figure out a better system for all these like chronic recurring UTIs, because people around the world suffer from this, particularly women, and give them a better standard of care out of this, right? Like, can we figure out a mechanism? And then if you look at that mechanism in a broader scale of like more people, does that continue to bear out? Like, I think that would be just like a more like practical, immediately useful thing to solve.
That sounds great, and definitely as a noble problem to solve. So I hope that it will happen. Well, I'm sure that it will happen because you are so, yeah, I mean, like, you're so dedicated to solving a real problem.
Definitely a little bit of TMI there. Too much information, Maria. You can tell I'm very open to like sharing everything.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Yeah, hope to see you soon at the next podcast together with Michael. Yeah, where we will dive deeper in the AI and drug development.
Yes, will do, Maria. Thank you so much again for having me on the podcast. This was a ton of fun. And thank you again for doing this. Folks out there, hopefully you find this useful, and direct all the praise to Maria and all the angry emails to me. How's that?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, Maria.